Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime, and welcome to part 2 of Richard Speck. I'm Joe, the host, and I usually like to keep these episodes to 10 minutes or so, and this part 2, I kept the part 1 to 10 minutes, but the part 2, no guarantees. I tried to time it out so that it would be around 10 minutes, ballpark 10 minutes, maybe a little bit longer. It will be a little bit longer. I almost told you a lie. It's going to be a little bit longer than 10 minutes. How much longer? I don't know yet, because obviously I haven't started talking yet, but we'll find out together. If you're brand new to the podcast and jumping into this episode and you have not listened to the previous one, you're going to miss some stuff. So go back and listen to part 1 of Richard Speck. This is part 2, and let's get to it. In 1966, 24-year-old Richard Speck returned home to Monmouth, Illinois, leaving behind most of his family and an outstanding arrest warrant. He got a job as a carpenter but lost it when he made a habit of skipping work to spend time at the bar. Richard tried to reconnect with his older sisters, who still lived in Monmouth, but none of them really wanted much to do with their black sheep younger brother. So Speck found himself living the same life that he had back in Dallas, floating between odd jobs, drinking heavily, and committing acts of violence. He also picked up a reputation of being a braggart and a liar. In bar conversations, he claimed that he left Dallas because he'd killed a man and spent time smuggling drugs into the country from Mexico. He probably didn't do that stuff, but he was definitely bragging about it. Just after midnight on April 2nd, 1966, Speck broke into the home of Virgil Harris, a 65-year-old woman. When rifling through the empty house, Speck heard Harris return home. He rushed to the front door and grabbed her. He pushed a knife up to her throat and threatened to kill her if she screamed. He pulled her into the bedroom and ordered her to remove her clothes before sexually assaulting her. Then he tied her up and fled. Harris managed to free herself and get to the hospital, where she reported the crime and described her assailant as, quote, a polite man with a southern drawl. A week later, Speck struck again. Mary Kay Pierce, a 32-year-old bartender, was found behind a tavern where she worked. She had been killed by a single blow to her abdomen by a blunt object which ruptured her liver. Within 2 days, the police focused their investigation on Richard Speck, who frequented the bar where Pierce worked, and according to her friends, had an interest in her. When they discovered that he was from Texas, the investigators realized that Speck, with his southern accent, was probably the guy from the Harris assault as well. The police got Richard back to the station, but their interrogations ended abruptly when Speck complained that he was feeling sick, and he asked to reschedule their questioning for a different day. And the police said, okay. As soon as he left the police station, he skipped town. It remains unclear to this day if Speck actually was responsible for the murder of Mary Kay Pierce, or if he simply did not want to take any chances of being convicted of that crime. He showed up unannounced at the Chicago home of his older sister, Martha. He told her and her husband a story, claiming that he had escaped Monmouth because of a gang of drug dealers that were out to get him. Martha was, of course, skeptical, but a sense of family obligation took over and she tried to help her sketchy brother. She and her husband got him a job as a deckhand on a freighter traveling the Great Lakes. Martha had hoped that the isolation and discipline of working on a boat might straighten him out. It didn't. His drinking and violence continued, and after barely 2 months aboard the freighter, Speck was fired for fighting. His sister kicked him out, so he got a room at a nearby boarding house. The work didn't come, he couldn't pay, so he got booted from there. On July 12th, Speck received an assignment on an oil tanker. He packed up and got to the dock, only to find that job was already taken. Richard spent the night on the park bench, and that next day he continued to wait as several deckhand jobs fell through. He convinced his brother-in-law to loan him $25 for a hotel, then immediately went to a nearby bar to drink. Later that night, Speck was walking between bars when he spotted 53-year-old Ella Mae Hooper. He made a few awkward advances toward her, catcalling, I would assume, and she tried to keep distance and ignore him, and that made Richard angry. He caught up to Ella Mae and pressed the knife against her back. He told her that they were going to have a drink together. If she refused, he'd stab her. Without much choice, she complied. He told her that he wasn't going to hurt her or rob her. He just wanted to talk. He led her back to his room at the hotel, where he sat down on the bed and offered her a beer. Richard started asking questions like, did she have a job? Did she have children? Did she like younger men? Would she sleep with him willingly? It seemed like Richard wasn't looking for another victim, but for someone to simply accept him, while the rest of the world rejected him. So she tried to be what Speck wanted in order to preserve her own life. She even said that she would sleep with him. But Speck did not believe her, so he ordered her onto the bed and raped her. Afterwards, he rifled through her purse and found a .22 caliber gun, which he took. Richard, now armed with a knife and a gun, walked LMA downstairs, back out onto the street. He returned to the bar where he continued drinking. Around 10 p.m., Richard Speck left the bar and returned to his room. After a day of drinking heavily, Richard collected his hunting knife and changed into an all-black outfit. The weather had cooled down by 11 p.m. as Richard Speck approached a row of townhouses. Speck knew that many of these residents there were nursing students from the South Chicago Community Hospital, using these homes as a dorm. On July 13, 1966, Richard Speck broke into the townhouse at 2319 100th Street in Chicago. He walked up to the first bedroom door. Inside the room were two Filipino exchange students in their early 20s, Corazon and Merlita. Corazon was asleep in her bed while Merlita recited her nightly prayers when they heard 4 quiet knocks on their door. Corazon didn't think anything was odd about the knock, so she opened the door. She was shocked to find a shadowy man standing on the other side, dressed in all black. The man raised his hand, leveling a gun, and stepped inside the bedroom. He asked where the other housemates were. Neither lady responded, too scared to speak. Richard ordered them to walk out of their bedroom as he pushed the gun into Corazon's back. He walked them to the large bedroom at the end of the hallway. Inside, Speck turned on the light to see 3 other students sleeping. As they began to groggily wake up, he stared down at them momentarily, seemingly lost in his own dark thoughts, or maybe trying to decide what to do next. While noticing Speck was momentarily distracted, Corazon and Merlita grabbed one of the waking nurses and bolted into the bedroom closet, slamming the door shut behind them. The 3 of them managed to hold it closed. For the moment, they were safe. Richard Speck held his gun out at the other nurses and told them to get their housemates to come out of the closet. He promised that he would not hurt anyone. They did what he asked. When they stepped out of the closet, he said he was only there for money enough to get him to New Orleans. The scared students offered Speck what little cash that they had in their purses. They gathered their money and then froze as they all heard footsteps coming up the stairs. Another student, Gloria Davey, had returned home from a date with her fiancé. When she approached the bedroom door, Speck burst out of the room and grabbed her. He threw Gloria onto the floor with the rest of the hostages and slid his knife out of his pocket. Bed sheets were cut into strips and used to tie them all up. Once they were bound, Speck chose his first victim, Pamela Wilkening. He pulled her into an empty bedroom and heard the front door open yet again. 2 more nursing students, Marianne Jordan and Suzanne Ferris, were happily chatting as they walked up the stairs, just getting home, completely unaware of what was happening in the house. They made it to the bedroom, where they were suddenly greeted by the horrifying sight of their housemates tied up. Richard emerged from one of the bedrooms, knife and gun held high. They screamed and tried to run, but Speck chased them down and blocked the exit, shoving the gun in their faces. He ordered them into the same room with Pamela. Inside that room, he killed Suzanne and Marianne by stabbing and strangling them both. Then he turned his attention back to Pamela, but abandoned his initial plan, which was to rape her. Instead, he stabbed her to death. Richard Speck may not have entered the townhouse that night with the intention of murder, but once the killing started, he only wanted more of it. Richard stumbled back to the master bedroom to select his next victim. He didn't notice, though, that one of his hostages, Corazon, had rolled herself underneath one of the beds and out of view. Over the next 3 hours, Speck took each student, one by one, out of the bedroom and killed them. Corazon Amurao silently hid under the bed, watching as her friends and roommates were dragged out of the room. She was helpless to fight back and too afraid to run. At 3 a.m., the bedroom was empty aside from her. She listened as he went through the remaining clothing and purses, stealing every last cent that he could find. Then he walked back down the stairs and left the townhouse. Speck walked back to the hotel, tossing the bloody knife in the river along the way. Back in the townhouse dorm, Corazon was shaking, crying, and still wedged in her hiding spot as the sun rose. At 5:30 a.m., she finally worked up the courage to undo her bindings and escape. She left the bedroom and saw the carnage that Richard Speck left in his wake. Corazon opened a second-floor window with shaky hands and crawled out onto the ledge. She began to scream, "They're all dead. My friends are all dead." The police arrived, and Corazon Amurao was able to give them a good description of the killer, which included a thick Southern accent. Investigators asked around town and discovered that several people had seen or spoken to a man that fit that exact description. By the time the investigators had learned his name, Speck had already started his day. He woke up, went down to the bar, and ordered his first drink, seemingly without a care in the world. As Speck happily drank his way into the afternoon, the police made their move. They had a job recruiter call and ask him to report to an opening on a ship. Somehow, Speck knew that this was a setup, and instead of walking into the trap, he hopped into a cab and headed to the north side of Chicago. Having put some distance between himself and the police, Richard wandered into yet another bar and continued his drinking. Within 3 days of the murders, Speck saw his own name and face printed across the front page of the Chicago Tribune. The updated description of the suspect included an account of Speck's tattoos, including the words, "Born to Raise Hell," inked on his left forearm. Speck checked into a low-rent hotel where, ironically, the rooms resembled prison cells, and he tried to plan his next move. He had nowhere to go, no more money, and no more options, and he could only see one way out. On the Saturday night of January 16th, Speck cut his wrists open with a broken wine bottle. Neighboring hotel guests found him covered in blood. He was rushed to the hospital where doctors worked to save his life. One of the doctors working on Speck's injured arm recognized the "Born to Raise Hell" tattoo from the newspaper story. The doctor asked the patient what his name was. He replied that his name was Richard Speck. The police showed up and placed him in leg shackles even before the hospital staff had finished saving his life. When he recovered, Speck was booked and sent to the Cook County Jail, where he was evaluated mentally. They determined that he was fit to stand trial. The trial began on April 3, 1967. The press and general public were both fascinated and disturbed by the crime and the seemingly inhumane sociopathic killer. Throughout his trial, Speck remained emotionless and cold. He claimed that he had no memory of the mass murder due to the alcohol and drugs that were in his system at the time. Even if he did commit the crime, his attorneys argued he wasn't responsible for his actions. The jail psychiatrist who examined and treated Speck supported this theory. He claimed that Speck had suffered serious head trauma as a teenager, leaving brain damage that caused violence when mixed with alcohol and drugs in recent years. Now, there has been more recent scientific evidence to support that hypothesis, but in 1967, that argument didn't hold water in court. After a 2-week trial and 49 minutes of jury deliberations, Richard Speck was found guilty. The jury recommended the death penalty. In 1972, the Supreme Court declared the death penalty illegal, and Richard Speck was resentenced to serve 8 consecutive sentences of 50 to 150 years. In the years after, Speck gave a few interviews. In 1978, he admitted to killing the student nurses and claimed that he felt sorry for what he had done, but he still couldn't explain why he did it. 10 years after that, Richard was asked again in an interview why he had killed the nurses. He responded, quote, "It just wasn't their night." The real motivation behind Speck's killings remains a mystery to this day. At the time, authorities, including the board of psychologists consulted at his trial, deemed Speck a sociopath who killed for his own gratification. In the interview he gave in 1978, Speck was asked if he had any final thoughts for the American people. He responded, quote, "Just tell them to keep up their hatred for me. I know that it keeps up their morale, and I don't know what I'd do without it." Richard Speck spent his entire life believing that the world hated him and was punishing him with tragedy, abuse, and isolation. Finally, after committing one of the bloodiest crimes in American history, Richard Speck felt vindicated. The world finally truly hated him as much as he always thought that it did. That's 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. And like I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, it wasn't 10 minutes. Just a little bit longer. Still brief and bingeable. It still fits into that category, but honestly, I could have talked for an hour about Richard Speck and one of the bloodiest crimes in American history, as I mentioned. And that crime, that mass murder, is when the term mass murder became coined. No one was really saying it before then. Hey, thank you for sticking with me to part 2 of this story. If you are brand new to this podcast, I hope that you liked what you heard and you become a subscriber to 10-Minute Murder. Wherever you're listening right now, find where you subscribe. It doesn't always say the word subscribe, so a lot of the places it does. Some of them it says collect or follow. In the instance of Apple Podcasts, there's a plus up in the top right-hand corner of the screen. You click that, and that makes you get all of the episodes as soon as they are released. You don't have to go searching for 10-Minute Murder every time you want to find out if there's a new episode. It'll pop up and download them automatically for you. You don't have to do any of the work. Connect with the show on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You'll stay updated that way, as well as see visuals that go along with the episodes. Nothing gross and nothing graphic. I'm not trying to give you nightmares, because if it gives you nightmares, it's definitely going to give me nightmares. Links are in the show notes of this episode, or go to 10minutemurder.com and find links to all things related to this podcast, as well as how to get in touch with me, which, by the way, joe@10minutemurder.com. That's my email address. Lastly, if you've got friends and you think they may be into creepy true crime podcasts like this one, brief and bingeable ones, let them know about 10-Minute Murder. Tell your mama and them. Thank you for listening. Be safe and make good choices.